Hello, welcome to my slideshow. I'm calling it the mystery of grading. Now, before I actually jump into this and start telling you about the research, I'm going to give you a bit of a background on my stream of thoughts that led me to this topic. You see, at first, you might remember that I was looking into researching, I guess you could call it international exit exams. I was really curious as to whether or not they are, well, how prevalent they are, first of all, but also if they have any positive effects on student learning. That seemed like a really broad topic when I actually started to research it, though. So I wanted to try to narrow it down even more. I decided to start thinking about grades in particular. What exactly is grading? And what's the point of it? This really came into focus when I was looking at one of the questions in our forums. Should letter grades be used with rubrics? In particular, I think Gina had a great observation and a great model that really got me thinking even more. Should we have our maximum grade in a rubric be above and beyond the expectations, which we tend to associate with an A level grade? So, what is an A? What is a B? What is a C? And this is what I'm trying to figure out. What is the purpose of these grades? Is it to motivate students, or are there other things? The research question I developed was, again, a bit of a challenge. I wanted it to be broad enough that I could find plenty of research and really go the direction I wanted to. But I also wanted to focus in on one particular area. What I settled on is this: are grades serving their purpose? Now, you'll probably agree that this is a really broad question, and there are a lot of questions that come to it. For example, what is the purpose of a grade? We kind of need to know that before we can decide whether or not grades are serving this purpose. Beyond that, though, we also look at what does the grade mean? We'll go into this much more deeply as I go through this presentation, but basically, we're trying to figure out how do we interpret the grade and what does the grade actually represent. Next, I'm looking at what risks are associated with grades. Now, this was a bit of a hard one to phrase. I don't mean to imply that grades are dangerous to education or anything even close to that. But I think we can all agree that there are some potential risks that come up with grading. In particular, I'm looking at bias, grade inflation, and motivational issues. Then finally, I wanted to look into the best practices of grading. What is an effective grade and which one is the most useful to teachers, to students, and to parents? So what is the purpose of the grade? The research I'm finding, which was predominantly conducted by a professor out of the University of Kentucky Education Department. His name is Thomas Guskey. His name actually came up in our textbook at one point, so I decided to look into him more deeply. And at this point, I have 4 or 5 articles that do go in depth about grades and what is their purpose. But coming back to this, it depends who you ask. Guskey actually conducted a survey in which he asked parents, teachers, and students to all rank the purpose of grades in order. Now, as you can see from this chart, numbers 1 and 2 are similar across the board. To communicate. Communicate with parents, communicate with students. After that, though, the 3rd and 4th position kind of does switch around, depending on who you ask. And then finally we end with the last 2, which actually did surprise me. It's particularly the lack of effort or responsibility. Maybe this is more of a secondary education trait, but I do know many teachers who use grades as a bit of a punishment or to teach responsibility. Now, I would argue that that's not the intent to punish necessarily, but ultimately it really is. When you give a student a 0 for not handing a paper on time, that really is a punishment. Regardless, once we develop what is the purpose of a grade, I wanted to go into more of what does the grade mean. First of all, what's represented by this grade? I included here an entire list of things that you could possibly be grading. You're grading tests, writings, labs, exhibits, homework, presentations, attendance, punctuality. You can read the list just fine. The problem is, we don't know what is represented in this grade necessarily. You can find different online programs that will help you sort this out, but the grade is simply a symbol. An A, a B, a C, a plus, an S, maybe a check, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, whatever style you use, it really is just a symbol. And it's really a mystery to understand what is in this symbol. Beyond that, though, if we do settle on an idea of what is represented by a grade, we still have the problem of interpretation. Let's use an example of 3 students. We have 3 students who earned an 80% in the course. One student started off really strong at the beginning with A+ work, and eventually over the course of the term, he went downhill, eventually with work that resulted in him getting the C. We have another girl who was the exact opposite. She started off very poorly in the semester, but as she went, she started raising her grade, finally resulting in that 80%. Do these 2 students have the same level of academic ability? Well, maybe not abilities. Do they have the same demonstration of mastery of the content? I think we can all agree that there is a difference. The girl who increased her grade to get to the 80%, she was learning over the course, whereas there's a pretty good argument that the boy, he had pre-existing knowledge and didn't learn anything new, thus reducing his grade. So what does that mean? Is that 80% really an accurate demonstration of how much a student learned in the course? I would argue no, and the research I'm finding is saying something very similar. So we want to look more at what risks come with grading. Now, a lot of the points that you'll see coming up here are things that we've probably thought about at some point. Bias. Whether we like to or not, well, disregard that. Whether we acknowledge it or not, there is going to be some bias in the way we grade. It could be bias based on past student performance, and we're trying to adjust for that. It could be bias based on handwriting. If you're anything like me, I certainly prefer an essay written in nice penmanship, but I try not to let that influence my grading. I'm sure there's some part of my mind, though, that does look at that trait in determining what is the level of quality of understanding. That's totally improper, but I think it happens. We also look at the issue of grade inflation. Last week, actually, a Harvard professor came out and started talking about grade inflation at Harvard, where essentially they're saying that the average grade at Harvard is an A-. Now, that's pretty outrageous. I mean, yeah, they're great students, I'm sure, but I would be very surprised if everyone earned an A just from the amount of effort they're putting into it. There's something else going behind grading, and this is an issue that I think is becoming more and more common. Now, the last 2 points are actually related to motivation. I'm trying to differentiate between the 2 of them here. In the first part, underworking, this actually comes directly from that conversation we had in the forum about rubrics and grades. I really liked what Gina did, and this actually inspired this part of the presentation. A student who meets all the qualifications, or all the expectations for an assignment, does not necessarily get the full points for it. You see, in most grading systems, an A is going to be considered very satisfactory work, or above and beyond what is expected, whereas a C usually is considered to be average. Well, why would we make simply meeting the minimum expectations being A work? As I thought about that more, I realized, no, meeting expectations is probably C quality work, maybe a little bit higher. And by changing the way we look at grading in this way, we can increase the motivation. That's what I meant over here by the underworking portion. Students might have a tendency to settle for what will get them an A, and they won't push themselves as much. Similarly, but actually conversely, the motivation of students can be affected by a grade. For example, if a student is consistently getting a C or a D in the class and is working very, very hard, how much motivation do they have to really explore that subject area more? Especially in the secondary levels, this could affect the entire direction that they want to go in terms of education. And I think that's the wrong thing. I think too much emphasis is being placed on these grades, and it's a mentality of I need to do well in this course because that's what I want to do in my career. And I don't think that's right. I wanted to see what the research says about grades and motivation, both positive and negative. Then I just wanted to end with a discussion about the best practices for grading. This is something that Professor Gusky, as I mentioned before, was very much into. He is coming up with 4 key things that he considers to be best practices, and really I agree. He's looking at this in criterion reference standards. Simply put, we're not doing the bell-shaped curve anymore. We are tying this directly to mastery of content. Differentiated grading criteria. In this one, we're looking at 3 different things. First of all, what is the final product that's being produced here? That's more of a traditional grading style. Summative assessments, we're looking at what is the end result. The process criteria, that second one, is much more about how did the student go from point A to point B. This is where you can start looking into how much effort they're putting into the training, how much outside research they're doing. This is all part of the process. Are they following the steps that they need to do to really grow as a student? And finally, progress criteria. This is acknowledging that not all students start at the same place. Some students have a strong understanding of geography, for example. Others don't feel comfortable with it at all. We need to account for this when we grade. One of the problems with that, though, is we do run into a larger risk of bias here, because just biased nature, it's going to be much more subjective. The third point that Gusky really emphasizes is effective reporting tools. Simply put, how are we going to communicate with the stakeholders in this case? And then finally, consistency. This one's a given, but I wanted to see what other researchers are saying about consistency, particularly when we do come to the product, the process, and the progress criteria. So, all in all, this research is pretty, like I said, pretty broad. I think it's interesting to me because I didn't really understand how grades actually work. I know it seems strange, but there's a lot that goes into grading that I didn't think of. One thing I stumbled across in my research was actually an idea from the 90s. They're looking at the idea of should teachers average grades from a semester? And my first impression was, well, yeah, absolutely. You want a representation of their work for the entire semester. But then I started reading more, and there is a problem with that. If you take an average of the entire semester, then you're putting just as much emphasis on, I think what Lewin and Shoemaker would say is the first risk. Instead, you want to have the most representative sample of their work, typically coming at the end of the term, when they've built on all their knowledge and they're able to apply that in a meaningful way. I thought that was a really good way of looking at things, and I wonder if that's a phenomenon that's developing just recently, or if it's something that a lot of people have, whether they know it or not. Regardless, from here, I really want to explore more of these modern day issues that are coming up with grading. If you have any suggestions for other things that I could look into, I should be thrilled to hear them. So please, let me know what you think of this. Let me know if you have any questions about the direction I'm going or what research I'm finding. You can take a look at these references that I have, and again, if you have others that you can suggest to me, I'd appreciate it. Thank you for your time.